Today we're going to look at the last meat source for protein, and that is beef. So ideally, you guys will be able to understand the grades of beef, the cuts of beef, and some common cooking methods of beef. So beef comes from mature cattle, and beef is unique because beef is really the only meat that is a bright red in color. So you can see that picture on there on the video. You see the bright red, and then there's kind of those marbled pieces of kind of white or a light pink, and that's actually the fat source in the meat. So why is beef red but other meat is not? Well, contrary to popular belief, that red in your beef, it's actually not blood. So let's learn about it.
Nothing beats the unique flavors of a summertime grill session. When the sun's out, there's really no other way to eat. And good lord, are there a lot of amazing chemical reactions happening over those flames. Get a bucket for your drool. We're about to get hit with some grill chem. Before your steak hits the grill, chances are it's a brilliant red. And if it's not, you better check the expiration date. But have you ever wondered what makes red meat red? Though it may seem like an obvious answer, our meats aren't getting their brilliant hue from blood. Steaks are made up of slow-twitch cow muscles, which means that they're used for long periods of time and use a lot of energy. To compensate, a protein called myoglobin helps store oxygen inside cells of muscles for a consistent energy supply. And as it turns out, this very protein is a pronounced red pigment. The more myoglobin inside the meat, the darker and the deeper the red will be. You may have noticed that vacuum-sealed steaks have a grayish tint to them. The lack of oxygen inside means a lack of fuel for myoglobin. And once you've opened the package and exposed it to oxygen, the surface of the meat will get back at least some of the reddish pink tint. When you throw your steak on the grill, myoglobin starts to transform. At temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius, myoglobin can't hold on to the oxygen anymore, and it shifts to a tan color. Once your steak hits 76 degrees Celsius, myoglobin goes through yet another transformation where it turns a grayish dark brown. But that's not the only thing that changes your steak's color. The Maillard reaction, the holy grail of all culinary chemical reactions, is the key to the mouth-watering molecular metamorphosis that kicks in when you throw your food on the grill. The Maillard reaction is actually a complex series of simultaneous reactions between amino acids and sugars that produces that rich brown cooked food color alongside hundreds of distinct flavor compounds. Now, on the topic of flavor compounds, let's go ahead and
All right, so that just explains quickly why beef is red and other meat is not, and also when you cook it, why it transforms into the brown color. All right, so when cattle are sent to be slaughtered, they are beef carcasses, and carcasses from there are divided into pieces, which we call beef cuts. And so you can see on the picture here, okay, kind of where each cut comes from. Okay, that kind of puts it in perspective. So next time you go and buy a package of beef or a steak or whatever, you can kind of see, where that's coming from. So the carcasses are first cut into halves and then into quarters, and that's how they're shipped to the grocery stores as quarters. And then they go ahead and break them down into further retail cuts that we might be a little bit more familiar with. So here's just a diagram of some of those cuts and where they come from out of those larger quarters. So if we take a look at the rib right here, out of the rib, they get these smaller cuts like back ribs, ribeye steak, ribeye roast, rib steak, rib roast. If we look at the round, so right here, the round is round steak, different locations of round steak. So bottom round steak, bottom round roast. You have a tip roast, top round steak. The sirloin is right here. Okay, so there's where a bunch of your different sirloin comes from. Loin. Okay, so loin is right here. And then we have chuck, okay? And so a bunch of that stuff is coming out of there. So again, out of those larger quarters, they get these smaller, what we call retail cuts, and that's when you go into the meat department at the store. That's typically what you're buying. You can also buy beef in the ground form. And so instead of cuts, what they do is they grind that up and then you see this ground form. So a couple different terminologies. Ground beef is when they literally just take a cut of meat, they put it through a grinder, and that's what you get. However, we typically say, well, we're getting some hamburger. So hamburger is a little different because hamburger can have some extra fat added into it during the grinding process. Now, when you're purchasing ground beef, you will probably notice a fat ratio. So for example, right here, it says you would read that as 90-10, okay? And you would read this as 80-20. And what that means is it's the degree of of how much fat is included in that. Okay, so for here, this is 80% lean, 20% fat, 90% lean, 10% fat. This one's going to be a leaner choice. And anytime you use the word lean when describing meat, that just means it has less fat in it. And typically the price is going to be higher when there is less fat in the product. So the higher this lean number is, typically the price is going to be significantly more than when you have a lower or a higher percentage of fat. So that's just kind of the difference. And this is not just on ground beef, really any ground form of meat, it's on there. We do a lot of ground turkey at my household, and it has the same thing. It has that ratio of fat there. So, quality of meat, so we call that the grade of meat. And really, it just means, how good is your meat on a quality standard. And the USDA kind of has these three like stamps that they put on there to tell you. So, you have USDA Prime, USDA Choice, and then USDA Select. And really, what they're looking at is you can see these pockets of white here. Okay, so I mentioned that right on that second slide, but those pockets of white and these little flecks of white right in here, so you can see there's a lot here, medium, and then not so much here. That's called marbling. And marbling, it's just the flecks of fat that appear throughout the meat. So cuts with more marbling are more appealing, tender, and they have a better taste because fat provides flavor. So the cuts with more marbling actually are pricier. So USDA Prime is typically what's going to be sold to restaurants, and that's the highest quality. And then you'll see USDA Choice and USDA Select in the stores. Um, so Choice Cuts is kind of that medium, and then USDA Select is has the least amount, so it's the lower end. So while marbling provides fat and which provides flavor, marbling also can kind of go the other way. So the fat, like I said, it affects the overall quality. What you want to look for the fat is it should be that kind of creamy white, and it should be firm to the touch. Like I know when I cut up roasts and stuff, like that stuff's pretty hard to cut through, so that's a sign of high quality. If that marbling has started to take like a yellowish hint to it and it kind of like starts to crumble, that's not very good quality meat. So, like I was saying, while marbling indicates how tender the beef is, it's also a sign of more fat, cholesterol, and calories in the meat. So, it's kind of like, well, what road are you going to take? Higher quality, better tasting meat, but then knowing that you're sacrificing that health aspect. So the location of meat and cooking. So we looked at the cuts and where each one comes from. But where the cut comes from on the cow will tell you how tender the cut will be. Okay. And a good rule of thumb is if you think about a cow and its daily activities and when it moves around, what parts is it using much more often? Okay. Well, think about the the backbone of the cow. That backbone's not getting a lot of exercise as compared to like the legs of the cow. So the more exercise a part of meat gets, the tougher it will be. So rib and loin, when we looked at the top, those are on the top, okay, kind of along the backbone of the cow. Those are tender because they don't get a lot of exercise while the cow is alive. But the leg and the shoulder and the cuts that come from that are going to be more tougher because the animal uses them more. So that's kind of when, if you've ever had like a piece of meat and you kind of have to keep chewing on it and keep chewing on it, well, that's just a tougher piece of meat. So depending on how tough that meat is, helps you decide how to cook it. So the different cooking methods that go with it to help really do the best thing for that cut of meat. So tender cuts of meat, because they have a lot more fat in them, they're more moist. They can be cooked with dry heat methods like broiling or roasting. But when you get into like those stew cuts of meat and those less tender cuts, that should definitely be cooked with moist heat. So that's really where you're cooking it when you have some added liquid to help soften that meat. Excuse me. This is a really good resource. It kind of breaks it down by category of how to cook it. And so it's beef, it's what's for dinner.com/cuts. And it goes through a really nice, again, it just shows you kind of how to cut it. So I'll load it just so you guys can see there. So you can see here, It kind of talks about like the best beef cuts for oven roasting. If you want to stir fry, what should you buy at the store? Ones that you want to marinate. What about what's good for slow cooking? Okay. So that's really nice that it has all of that there for you. Okay. So if you have a less tender piece of meat, we kind of usually call those like tougher cuts of meat. And something you can do is marinate. And so marinating is when you take a piece of your meat and you soak it in a flavorful liquid solution, and that's called a marinade. And so you can see this example here. This piece of meat is in this is in this marinade, and it's going to stay in there depending on the marinade, on the type of meat, for anywhere from 6 to 24 hours. Basically, what ends up happening is marinades usually have some sort of acidic ingredient like vinegar or tomato juice, and that kind of helps to break down some of the tougher some of the tougher aspects of that meat, and it helps to tenderize the meat. So inside the meat are the muscles, obviously, that the animal uses when it's alive, and that's called elastin and collagen. And so those acidic ingredients start to break down and target those two things to again help tenderize that. So the longer you leave it in there, the better for it. And you can marinate not just beef, you can marinate any type of meat, and it's really a great, it adds a really great flavor too. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a really tough piece of meat, but that's a really nice way to work around that to make a tough piece of meat more tender. So storing meat. So you've bought your meat. How do you store it? Well, if you buy fresh meat from the store, you want to store in the fridge and use within a few days. Once you have cooked your meat, or if you're buying already pre-cooked meat, then you want to store it in tightly covered containers. And if you were buying fresh meat and you want to go ahead and freeze it because you're not going to use it right away, you can freeze it in the original packaging for 2 weeks. But if it's going to be longer than that, you want to wrap it in heavy duty foil and place it in freezer bags. Or, like with seafood yesterday, we talked about moisture proof paper that you can put it in. You can do that as well. So I know a lot of people who will go in on like a quarter or a half a cow. Well, they're not going to eat all that within 2 weeks. So you want to make sure that you are freezing it properly so that way it doesn't get freezer burn or end up having to go to waste, because that's a lot of money down the drain. So, methods of cooking meat. So, here's just a few and just some kind of tips to go with each one. So, roasting is used for large, tender cuts of meat. Broiling and grilling kind of go hand in hand. Broiling is typically in the oven over a direct heat, a direct intense heat, where grilling is obviously just in your grill, but really good for different types of steaks and then also your ground beef as well. With broiling and grilling, you want to make sure that that piece of meat is not too thin because of how high the heat is. You could burn that pretty easily. Simmering and stewing, very similar. So, simmering and stewing is really good for those less tender cuts because you're cooking that meat in a larger amount of liquid. So, the only difference is that simmering is if you're doing like a whole cut of meat, so a larger cut of meat, where stewing is smaller pieces of meat. And I think that's pretty easy to remember because if you think about like beef stew, okay, those are like what, bite sized 1 inch pieces of meat. Then there's sauteing. And so, sauteing we're very familiar with. That's when you cook it in a small amount of fat over high heat. So think when we did stir fry. Sauteing is also called pan frying. So if you see that term, they're interchangeable. Sauteing or pan frying is often used to also sear meat, which is where you have that heat on really high and you quickly brown each side of the meat. And then you typically cook it another way to cook it completely through. And then there's braising. So, braising, simmering, and stewing are pretty similar except for the amount of liquid. So, braising is again for less tender cuts of meat, but instead of a lot of liquid, you just do a very small amount of liquid. You typically cover it in a pan and you cook it over low heat. So, beef and red meat is one of those meats that, depending on how you like it, it is how you can get it cooked. And so we consider that the degree of doneness. So it is one that people will eat undercooked a little bit if they want to. So you can see just the difference here. So that's why when you ask at a restaurant, they ask you how do you want it done, and you say medium or medium well or medium rare. They are temping that to make sure that it falls within these categories. So you have your rare, medium well, and then well done. So I think most people just think, oh, well, I just say medium rare and they cook it until they see that amount of pink. Well, it actually has that association with the degree as well. So I'm not going to get a super lot into the nutrition of beef. Um, and I'm going to let you guys explore that a little bit in your last column, in your last row, excuse me, on your protein source assignment. But beef, I would say, is the meat source that people say it's really good for you or it's really bad for you. And it's like back and forth as to whether or not it is good for you. So on one hand, we know beef is a really good source of protein, really good source of iron, and a lot of other vitamins and minerals. So it has a lot of good things for you. But beef also has a lot of saturated fat, which is the bad fat. It's linked to heart disease. And so it really comes under fire for that. So I'm going to let you guys explore as you look up those health benefits and those health risks, and you really make your own decision. With anything, I mean, if the only thing you're ever eating is meat or is beef, excuse me, you probably want to look at some other sources. But with everything, moderation, right? Okay. Um, so that's my little thing on nutrition on beef. So Google Classroom, you guys are going to tackle the red meat row, and really the animal source there is cow, right? Beef. And this is the last one that you guys have to do. So after this, your whole chart should be complete. And so go ahead and turn that assignment in once it's completed. All right, as always, reach out to me if any questions, and have a great rest of your day.